Hey folks, I'm Tyler Endlin and welcome back to another video, and we're going to be doing color light, particularly atmospheric lighting, and particularly one particular aspect of atmospheric lighting, and that is contre-jour lighting. I probably said that wrong. I'm sure some of you will correct me, but here's a list of the topics for this week. We're going to recap, we're going to go over a few key facts that I've covered in prior videos, and then contre-jour lighting itself. What is it? Why it's cool? Photography versus painting? And the examples. And then I'll do a quick demo in the form of a study, kind of showcasing how to go about this. Alright, so let's go. Alright, so yeah, in the last video we looked at the benefits of limiting our color palettes and how limiting these palettes gives us a preset context to work in. Essentially, it helps alleviate a lot of the intimidation behind choosing the right color. After all, it's just far easier choosing between 3 colors over 12. Next, as a preface here, I need to note something about grays or neutrals. The bright colors are louder than neutrals, and we need to keep a painting in balance by controlling our saturation. And grays are all about context, meaning they can look warmer or cooler depending on the colors near them. The same gray can appear warm in one painting and cool in another. I spoke about this in my Do My Shadows Suck video. Now, as I discussed prior with atmospheric perspective, saturation does tend to decrease with distance, as this photograph clearly displays here. Now, the other aspect worth showing here in regards to saturation is that the gap between the average light and average shadow on objects narrows the further we go in the background. So as you can see here, there's a fairly huge difference. The contrast is a lot higher as it is in the foreground, but the further we go, the less this gap actually becomes, and it just becomes more like whatever the atmosphere currently is. And in today's video, we're going to be looking at that very specific type of atmospheric lighting referred to as the French as contre-jour lighting. This literally translates to the rest of us as against the day, or painting directly into the light. Now, these images tend to be powerful, striking, and simple by structure. Like, look at this example by this fantastic painter named Joseph Zbukvic, which I've learned from Marco Bucci himself. He really turned me on to this painter, and he's phenomenal. He really does capitalize on this sort of lighting scenario. And this is a prime example of it, because it's not necessarily like sunset in a lot of these occasions where, for example, you'd have the sun directly behind it, but it's more like these are in daylight. The sun is usually just out of frame, and the light is just beaming in through the entire painting, through all the atmosphere. So it has a way of vastly simplifying loads of detail in most of the image. In fact, you only do get clear shapes and clear bits of information directly where these highlights are, in all the little areas that I'm kind of highlighting now in purple or pink here, right? Little details there, little details along that line, and in through there. But the rest of the image, the 90% of the image, is insanely simple, and that's the beauty of this. So when we're looking at either reality when it's like this, or we're looking through observation, or we want to design a picture, it's often best to look at how simple it can actually be in terms of the pieces and components, right? So this is one giant simple light shape up here, simple light shape up here, and then of course we have the reciprocating shape of the highlights, which in this case, see, it's a little bit more complicated. There's nice big, medium, and small variants on this, as well in here, a couple little guys, trails off, and in here. But the rest of this, you could technically group into one category, that being shadow. This is all shadow. And then this is all shadow. There's some subtle value shifts, for sure, but like, that's how simple the structure of these images really do tend to be. Now, I have a few examples of this in my own gallery, some successful, some not as successful. I think my more successful ones tend to be like in this image here. So the light, it's a day shot, it's coming down, and I just kind of have that light spill into some of these highlight areas, but a lot of the image is actually fairly simple. They're getting a little bit of light on the top, but I'm blowing the light out to show a lot of detail on these characters in the foreground. This is actually a fairly good example of that as well, this little sketch of some floating continents. You can see the light just kind of spill through, really simplifying a lot of these shapes. We see the top of some of these forms lit, and then over here, but a lot of it's in shadow, and a lot of it's very simple. I don't think I did a great job with that lighting on this image. I have too clear of shapes, not enough atmosphere, too many highlights within the shadow side. I didn't clearly show my families of lights and shadows, and it just didn't work that well. This I did a little bit better, but I think these images are 5-6 years old in some cases, and yeah, I've learned a lot since then, so hopefully I can keep practicing this myself. Photographers use this term as well when they try to capture light, but honestly the camera is just not able to capture the wide enough intensities required to do so. And most of the time shapes or objects just get washed out, they get silhouetted by the light, and they often just revert and go to black. And I think these examples on screen kind of clearly display this, even though in this top left piece of photography, it's broad daylight and the camera is just not able to pick up any color or light in the shadows on those trees at all, whereas the painters can really embellish that. Animated movies have been taking advantage of this lighting scenario for decades. Look what Paul Lassane and his team did with the color palettes on the Prince of Egypt film. They're absolutely using light as their paintbrush as they paint the light into these shapes and silhouettes. Paul's painting in particular is beautiful. As you can see, there's not almost like any distinguishable shapes toward the background. A lot of them get softer, a lot of them get washed out, and they're just fairly embellished in regards to that color. So he's playing more so on the mood and the tone. James Gurney does this a lot too in his books like Dinotopia, absolutely romanticizing his illustrations with this type of lighting. It's very powerful, it's uplifting, and even though his figures and landscapes are going into silhouette, the colors do weaken, but the shadows that they stretch forward, details disappear as the glare of light spills over the edges of these forms, and the sun itself often shines inside that frame of picture. So sometimes you can see it directly in the shot, sometimes, as you see on the left, it's just outside the picture frame. And yeah, of course, concept artists love this lighting scenario too. And one of the cool aspects about this is that even though the atmosphere is really thick and light is getting dispersed and diffused coming through it, it's still like a great way you can show how highlights can absolutely pierce through the atmosphere, and you can forge dynamic compositions with this. And of course, the benefits of this again for artists is that they typically don't take as long to paint, and they actually require far less drawing since most of the details get lost in the light or the atmosphere. Alright, so a great way to put anything into practice, particularly if you're a beginner, is to find suitable reference, subject matter, or maybe even existing painting, and do a controlled study of that. And by that I mean, limit yourself. I did this in 15 minutes, maybe put a half hour, double the time for you if you're a little less experienced, and focus on just creating, at least in these first steps, the shapes of atmosphere, because that's essentially what an image like this is portraying. It's just, you have to be able to see through all the details, not fuss with any of the pedantic details anywhere, and just focus on shapes of color, or in our particular scenario here, shapes of atmosphere. So I'm not, at least early on, I'm not looking at this as this is a building, and oh, this is a window, this is power lines, this is a street. Now these are just simple abstract shapes. And that, as I say almost every week on this channel, is Composition 101, being able to identify some shapes. Now, I had a copy of the painting that I just ran the the line filter on, or whatever it is, just so I can focus on getting a little bit of accuracy here with even more speed. Because again, this is not a video on perspective, this is not a video on drawing, this is a video about nailing some lighting with, of course, some simple shapes. And when I'm doing this, I like to paint a lot of that light, which I'm saving for the lights. I'm going to bring them all into my shadow areas. So this works for pretty much any medium, except for like maybe some types of gouache and watercolor. You do it the reverse. You have to save your highlights for last. So since I work like 100% digitally, I like to come in and set my shadow tones first and then paint the light into the shadows. So I'm just interpreting this. I don't think there's not the time and there's not as much value in literally trying to copy that photo one for one. Because once that happens, you're essentially just shutting off your brain to receiving a lot of the academic information you'll probably be seeking. And it just becomes about copying. So no color picking, that's another big thing. And just interpret. Again, be loose. I encourage you to be loose with this because you don't want to get caught up with the fussiness of individual colors. And if you lay a color down, keep it there. Don't step backwards, just paint over it. Just try to go forward, constantly keeping forward moving momentum. And of course, focusing on these shapes. So right now I am focusing on the core premise of these shadow colors. And they're a little bit warmer because the scene itself is fairly warm. But I'm going to add some cooler accents to those at the end. So I'm kind of overcompensating off the bat by going that's why there's a bright sort of orange, or it's an orangey neutral on the ground, for example. And my plan is if I can kind of neutralize, and there's a lot more atmosphere, there's a lot cooler colors, there's a lot less contrast in the background, because I'm going to basically take the shapes of light that are splintering their way through. As I say, these highlights will pierce the ground and some of the areas in the midground. I'll be able to just do that in one quick go because I'm familiar with the digital medium. I know what just using an airbrush on a linear light mode will do, and you'll see that momentarily. So see, this is where I'm coming back and I'm balancing out those oranges by putting in some neutral sort of blues and purples in there to show that there's some fill light. And that fill light, as I go further back, like behind the character, see I'm taking some of the blue out, neutralizing that color quite a bit. So it's softening it as a whole, and I'm adding or compensating for that atmospheric perspective that would be affecting that color. And then, of course, I'm jumping around trying to get a few of these basic shapes in there. Maybe imply that there's a few certain window elements or just smaller shapes breakdown, because I figured out the big shapes first, and I think I didn't mention that, but that's what you want to do, is figure out the big shapes to the smaller shapes. And this is what I was saying. I'm trying a few different blending modes. I was like, okay, that really warmed things up, but I want to blast the light into this because I want to paint with all fairly overexposed highlights, because that's how the lighting in these types of images typically go. So I made a selection, this is the shape of my highlight, and I'm literally just dragging a singular airbrush that was like a yellowy orange, but it's also on a linear light mode because I know that's just going to go super heavy. And what that does, if you're doing like a watercolor painting, that's saving your lights. It's instantly just kind of bringing them back. So I don't have to fuss with saving highlights and stuff earlier on because I know digitally there's enough powerful engines going on and underneath the hood to make it just work. And then from here out, okay, structurally that's right. There's a lot to be desired from this, from sure. I definitely need to adjust a lot of the littler things and get a little bit more color out of it. But in real time, this is at the 11 or 12th minute mark, so they're very quick, and that's what you want to practice. If you're trying to practice color and light, do it from reality, do it from reference, whether it's photo, whether it's outside from your house, and keep them quick and dirty, because that way the painting, the second you make these things take a long time, the more you're starting to focus on things that are not color and light, that you're focusing on details, that you're focusing on anatomy, that you're focusing on anything that's not directly related to, and that's where a lot of beginners tend to slip. It's you got to keep these things quick and dirty, and it's about the expression of that color. So focusing less on the literal side of things and just going in with a little bit more color and then feeling your way through it, because as I said, color is all contextual. These colors will look and feel different depending on what's around. So that's why you'll see, like, sometimes I need to lighten the background a little bit more, sometimes I need to darken the edges a little bit more to just make the background feel a little bit lighter. It's kind of like a give and take, and even though I've been doing this for ages at this point, I'm not going to nail it the first time. Like, the background, it's still not working quite yet. That was a first pass. I can go in, even if I spend 2 minutes, you could kind of tinker with and fuss with that overall structure just to get it in there and set just a little bit brighter. See, I'm kind of starting to adjust or compensate for that now. It was just, it was not reading the way I wanted it to. But yeah, that's kind of wrapping this up. So try this on your own, guys. Let me know if you have, if you want to try it. I'd love to hear from you. And yeah, feel free to weigh in on that. But yeah, this is just a really great way to practice these. So let's just recap a few points here. All right, so just as a brief little checklist, sort of things that we can notice and observe when painting this type of lighting. Notice that the areas that are warm are always warmer than areas in the direct shadow. You always need to ensure you are maintaining a warm versus cool relationship. And in most pictures, at least on this planet, right, often this is going to mean that shadows will get quite highly saturated blues and violets. Notice that compared to the photo, I'm able to get a lot more color into the shadow areas, into the darkest of the dark areas. One area to notice that is like on the main figure, the female there. A lot of her gets just completely washed out. You get to see some nice bounce light on her pants, but that's all. I was able to put lots of subtle notes of color into her silhouette. Of course, if you're trying to tackle this type of lighting at dawn or dusk, like twilight hour, of course the atmosphere will change in color, as I've covered in previous videos during those times. I wanted to thank you again for your support on last week's video. Somehow that pleased the YouTube algorithm gods, and it did pretty well, so thank you guys. I appreciate that. But of course now I have to do my shameless plug. That was what I didn't say then. That was actually only a third of the actual video that I'm going to be uploading to patrons starting like next week. In this video that you're watching today, that's only about a third of this actual video as well. I'm covering a lot more content, including lighting keys, different types of atmospheric perspective, volumetric lighting, different types of color script. It's going to have a lot of content and information in it, so feel free to head over to brushsauceacademy.com if you want a sneak peek at all the things I'm going to be featuring. Take care, guys.